about mental illness, like I said, and I appreciate that verse, and I just want to read it for you again. But we all, with unveiled face, beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from glory to glory, just as by the Spirit of the Lord. So this is the interesting thing, though. It says, what are we actually seeing when we look in the mirror? We're not seeing ourselves, are we? Because when we're beholding, as in a mirror, just like a mirror, what are we seeing instead? The glory of the Lord. That's an interesting way to talk to us. Instead of looking in a mirror seeing ourselves, we're supposed to see the glory of the Lord. And then, because we're looking at the glory of the Lord, what actually happens to our image? We're supposed to actually take on that image. And it becomes like us. I think that's the definition of a true Christian. When we behold Jesus, it's not that we try to be like him first. It's that when we look to him, we can't help but becoming like him. So, in other words, by beholding, we become changed. But what happens when we behold other things? I want to talk a little bit about anxiety and depression today. And when we talk about anxiety and depression, when you often hear people say things like, oh, I have anxiety, or oh, I have depression, I want you to understand they're not the same as somebody who just feels depressed for a time. A diagnosis of depression can include things like major depressive disorder. It can include like bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. It can include even something that happens this time of year, seasonal affective disorder. You guys are actually known for having one of the worst seasonal affective disorders. Did you know that? Did you know that's also probably why there's so many coffee shops here too? Yes. Yes, here and New England, the far north, even Canada, that part. But all of these things, when we think of anxiety and depression, there's a difference between feeling depressed and being depressed, or feeling anxious versus being anxious. One is a feeling and the other is a diagnosis, and you have to have a pervasive pattern of that. But when we talk about anxiety, there's actually signs. And I want to share some of those with you. The first one we're going to look at is mental signs of anxiety. So one is worry or feeling on edge. If you have any kind of anxiety diagnosis, say like OCD, generalized anxiety disorder, even PTSD, or any kind of phobias, you're actually going to feel, unlike other people who can relax in moments, you're going to have a perpetual, pervasive feeling like you just can't relax. And so that's one of the symptoms of anxiety. Also feeling nervous or unease, even panic and fear. And by the way, anxiety or an anxiety disorder is actually a disorder of fear. So anytime you think of somebody who has anxiety, or if you have anxiety, there's actually an underlying fear behind that, which causes the anxiety. You also might have racing thoughts, hypervigilance, and even irritability. But then there are some physical signs too. Anxiety is known for its physical signs. Unlike some of the other illnesses, anxiety has a lot of physical signs, including difficulty or rapid breathing, tightness in the chest, even stomach aches. I know this because I had horrible anxiety when I was a child, and I didn't realize back then my mom was quite a health nut, and so whenever I had these stomach aches, she thought, well, maybe I just need to give Mandy some charcoal. And so I took a lot of charcoal as a kid, not realizing charcoal's not going to help it when it's an anxiety disorder, but I had terrible anxiety back then. Headaches and migraines. And this is actually one of the ways that we know children have anxiety too. They can't often say, oh, I feel anxious. So what do? They talk about their stomach aches and their head hurting. And those are signs that even children can have anxiety. But also a feeling of restlessness, even muscle tension, fatigue. Why do we feel fatigue? Because our thoughts are racing all the time and our body's having all of these physical symptoms. Even sleep problems. Sometimes you can't sleep, sometimes you sleep too much. Hot and cold flushes. Oftentimes that can be from, having the PTSD, where the hypervigilance and even nightmares. Shaking and even bowel issues, IBS, and dizziness can all be physical signs of anxiety. And it's interesting, one of my favorite books in the Bible that talk about depression and anxiety is not really talking about depression and anxiety, but giving us a picture of what it looks like. And in Psalms 3, 1 and 2, we hear David say, which is ironic that the children's story was about David, "Lord, how many are my foes?" David was saying. "How many rise up against me? Many are saying of me, God will not deliver him." Do you think David had anxiety? I think he had a lot of anxiety. And it wasn't just, oh, I feel anxious right now. He had a lot of pervasive anxiety. Anxiety signs can also include things like phobias, snakes, spiders, public places, germs, cleanliness, and even avoidance. Sometimes phobias have to do with, even one of the big ones that's rising lately is social anxiety. A lot of people have social anxiety. And contrary to what people think about social anxiety, it's not just being afraid to go out and be around people. It's even deeper than that. It's a fear that people will judge me if I go out and I'm in that group. It's a constant feeling of people looking at you and judging you and thinking ill of you or having difficult thoughts about you. Obsessions or compulsions to ease the anxiety is also a part of anxiety signs, and even nightmares or flashbacks. I've had clients who have been prisoners of war, and they've come back and they've been sitting in my office, and I will watch them literally. I can see the movie playing in their mind of all of the things that have happened to them, and they're wringing their hands while they're doing it, and they don't even acknowledge that I'm there because they're having these flashbacks in that moment. And I've even seen, I call it secondary PTSD, sometimes when children are around parents long enough who have had flashbacks, they will have secondary PTSD because they will also experience the anxiety watching their parents go through that as well. But I also want to share with you, because sometimes, a little information can be dangerous. I want to share with you some things that anxiety disorder is not. Someone getting nervous to talk to somebody. That doesn't mean you have an anxiety disorder just because you're nervous to talk to someone. Having to confront an important issue. Any of you ever feel anxious about doing that? Oh, I don't want to talk to that person because I know it's probably not going to go the way that I planned. That does not mean you have an anxiety disorder. You can have anxiety about it, but it doesn't mean you have an anxiety disorder. Getting up to speak. Anybody terrified of getting up to speak? I used to. It's amazing what God does with you when you're terrified of something. Sometimes He'll expose you to it until you no longer fear it anymore. But that's supposed to be number one. Even fear of death, many people would rather experience death than get up and speak. How about making a big decision? Have you ever had a big decision looming? Just having anxiety about that big decision does not mean you have an anxiety disorder. And taking a test and the anxiety that comes with that does not mean you have an anxiety disorder. How about depression signs? One of the symptoms of that is prolonged sadness and unexplained crying spells. Many of my clients, I hear them say, I cry and I don't even know why I'm crying. Well, here's the funny thing is, do you know depression and anxiety often go hand in hand? What happens, and we do this, a lot of us do this often, is when we cry, what do? We tell ourselves, why am I crying? There's something wrong with me. So what do you think that does to the crying? Now you're crying about crying. And it just becomes this pervasive pattern that, why am I crying? Well, I'm beating myself up with causing me to cry even more. So unexplained crying spells, significant changes in appetite and even sleep patterns. It's hard to say one type of sleep problem versus eating problem and so on and so forth, because sometimes you can sleep more, you can sleep less, you can have trouble staying asleep, you can have trouble going to sleep, but once you go to sleep, you sleep just fine. So all of these sleep and appetite issues. Irritability, you heard that with anxiety, but you can also have that with depression. Oftentimes, anger is a big sign of depression. Socially speaking, men do not often like to admit they're depressed, and so what happens? It often plays out in anger outbursts or that sort of thing. So, anger, worry, agitation, and even anxiety can be a sign of depression too. Pessimism or indifference. Sometimes we're depressed because or we look like we can't make decisions because we're actually depressed. Loss of energy and even persistent lethargy. Also, feelings of guilt, worthlessness, and hopelessness. You know, if you have a sense of hopelessness or worthlessness, that is already an indication of depression, a symptom of depression. Poor concentration or indecisiveness. In fact, even poor concentration, some people are actually wrongly diagnosed as having dementia when what they really have is depression. Because you'll feel like you're foggy in your mind when you're depressed long enough. And I've seen people, if you've been in the Adventist church a long time, what do we like to do sometimes on Sabbath afternoon? Sing at the old folks' homes, right? And I've been in old folks' homes where I've seen people who look very, very young to be there. I'm thinking, that person almost looks like they can't be much older than me. And I wonder if they've been wrongly diagnosed as having dementia because they're actually depressed. And a lot of times we have people in our lives who are older and we just assume, oh, they have dementia. But in fact, they might actually be depressed, and once you take care of the depression, then their memory will be just fine. Inability to take pleasure in former interests. We call this anhedonia. It's a fancy word for I have a lot of apathy. I don't want to do the things that I used to enjoy doing. So if you used to enjoy playing a sport and you don't enjoy that anymore, that could be a sign that you have depression. Social isolation can also be a sign of depression. Unexplained aches and pains. What happens in the mind, we don't often realize this, but our minds, when our minds are depressed, what's connected to the mind? The rest of the body. And our thoughts actually have the ability to change our biology. And our biology affects our body. And so we can have all kinds of pains. Some people think even fibromyalgia can be connected to depression. And it's interesting, one of the depression medications, or one of the fibromyalgia medications, is actually a depression medication. And so when you take care of the depression, even a lot of the aches and pains that we often experience in our extremities go away too. I love being a therapist, by the way. Some of the things the doctors can't explain, no offense to the doctors in the room, I get to help people with, and I didn't even give them a medication for. So it's often quite fun to help people as a therapist. Recurring thoughts of death or suicide is a sign of depression as well. And we see in Psalm 6, verse 6, David talking about his depression too. He says, I am worn out from groaning. All night long I flood my bed with weeping and drench my couch with tears. What a visual to see David's depression that he was experiencing. What is depression not? Grieving after a breakup. You actually have to grieve for more than a month in order for you to be diagnosed with depression. Grieving after a loved one or pet dies. Not everybody who grieves has clinical depression. Grieving after the loss of a dream. We often think of grieving as only about our loved ones or pets and that sort of thing. But in fact, a lot of people get depressed because they had a goal or a dream in mind and that hasn't come to fruition, and so they become depressed about that. But it doesn't mean just because you lose a dream or a loved one that you will automatically be diagnosed with depression. And also another one people think is being a teenager. That does not automatically make you depressed. It's not something that you have to experience just because you're between 13 and 18 or 19 years old. You don't have to be depressed as a teenager. These are some signs of self-harm and suicide. Scars, often in patterns. That's especially related to cutting and that sort of thing. Fresh cuts, scratches, bruises, and bite marks or other wounds can also be a sign. Excessive rubbing of an area to create a burn. I've watched people use things like erasers to create burn marks on their body. Keeping sharp objects on hand. That doesn't mean that everybody who carries a pocket knife is automatically going to hurt themselves. But this is one I see a lot of with young people, and it's not necessarily a sign of self-harm or suicide, but it very often is. It can also be a sign of just not wanting to be seen, is wearing long sleeves or long pants even in hot weather. Maybe that doesn't happen so much here because I know it's cold a lot, but young people, and this is something I even saw during COVID, a lot of my teenage clients were wearing masks actually after COVID. And it had nothing to do with their fear of contracting COVID. It had to do with not wanting to be seen. You know, sometimes we see the teenagers with the hoods over their heads. Well, a mask is another great way to hide. And if you don't want to be seen, if you're insecure, wearing a mask can often be a sign of depression or anxiety or even self-harm. Other signs include frequent reports of accidental injury, difficulties in interpersonal relationships. Sometimes that has to do with borderline personality, and they do have a very high risk of self-harm. Behavioral and emotional instability, impulsivity, making lots of rash decisions, and unpredictability can also be a sign. And statements of helplessness, hopelessness, or worthlessness, and even overachieving. Now, I don't want you to think that just because somebody overachieves that can be self-harm or suicide sign, but how often do we hear in the news, oh, this person was the valedictorian, or this person was the cheerleader or the football jock in school? Just because they're doing well doesn't mean they're doing it for all the right reasons. Sometimes they're doing it to compensate for feelings of inadequacy and other things. But I want to spend a little bit of time with you now talking about some things that actually lead to depression and anxiety, because often what you hear in the commercials when you're hearing about a new depression or anxiety medication, you'll often hear the commercials say something along the lines of, well, we don't know why this happens. How reassuring is that when you're dealing with something like depression and anxiety, for them to tell you, and well-educated people who do a lot of scientific work, to hear them say, well, we don't know why this happens. Actually, that's not true. We do know some of the reasons why that happens, and I want to share some of those with you. One of the things that I want to encourage parents with is, I hear a lot of parents get excited when their kids read. Have you heard parents get excited when their kids read? I do not automatically get excited when kids are reading. Do you know why? Because it's not so important what or that they're reading, it's important what they're reading. Because I have seen kids read 800-page novels only to find out when I ask those same kids, because they're coming to me because they have depression and anxiety, tell me what you're reading about. And I came across this. Did you know a lot of books nowadays for kids? And all you have to do, one of the most depressing places I've ever been is Barnes & Noble. Ask my husband, I will not go in there anymore. Do you know why? If you go into the children's and young adult section, do you know what every single book is about nowadays? Supernatural stuff, including spiritualism, fantasy, romance, which romance is a very generous word. I would call it lust, if I was to give it an accurate title. And all of these often are related to these dystopian themes. And what are these dystopian themes? They focus on societies with great suffering or injustice. So why would a bunch of kids want to read about that? That's really depressing. Because they're often devoid of leaders, of good leaders And what does that do then? A young person rises up and gets to do their own thing their own way and succeed in that environment without being told what to do. How many kids like to be told what to do? Just ask your kid. Do you like me telling you what to do? They don't. And most of these stories, and if you look at even not just dystopian themes, but a lot of kids' even shows, you'll notice parents are no longer involved in the storyline. When I was growing up, Little House on the Prairie was like a big deal. I loved that show. I looked at it again and I realized, wow, I didn't know what I was watching. The books are better than the show, by the way. But when I looked at that, Ma and Pa are involved in every storyline. If Laura has a problem, if Mary has a problem, any of the other kids have a problem, Mom and Dad get involved. Nowadays, kids will show up at a coffee shop. By the way, I don't know why little kids are going to coffee shops. And they're hanging out like they're adults, and I'm thinking, who took them there? How'd they pay for it? But these are the storylines in school. By the way, has anybody ever noticed in Peanuts, anytime the parents talk, you never see their heads. And what do the kids hear? Wah, 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 wah. What is that teaching kids? The parents don't matter. Now, I never thought of that until I became a therapist. It completely went over my head. But a lot of these stories are actually reinforcing kids not needing parental involvement. They're also encouraging kids to, hey, make your own choices, do your own things. Even, dare I say, Disney movies, a specific snow princess storyline. There's a song all about it. I don't have to obey the rules. I can do it my way. Let it go. Okay, now you know. Drug references. Do you know our society now normalizes drugs? I was in probably one of the rare town hall meetings a couple years ago where we were actually fighting not to let recreational cannabis come in to our town. Only to find out not too long ago, we were driving by and sure enough, there's recreational cannabis. And I was like, how did we miss this? We voted against this. Well, they made a rule and they got through on a technicality. But our society has largely normalized this until even parents and adults are talking about there's nothing wrong with cannabis. It's medicinal. It helps. But do you know that you can actually have a psychotic break from using cannabis? Has anybody ever known somebody who had a psychotic break where the person in your life actually started acting like they had schizophrenia? Because of it, that is a side effect of cannabis use. You can also even get toxicity from cannabis oil using too much of it. You never hear people talk about this. And I'm like, how come nobody's saying this? I will say it if nobody else will. I've seen this over and over again. In fact, I had a client who was a young man, probably maybe 22, 23. He went to, ironically, an essential oils convention with his mom and was doing cannabis outside and came in and actually attacked a security guard. His mom was so embarrassed because they got escorted out of the essential oils convention and she wasn't planning on that. And for many months and even years later, he was dealing with the side effects of that psychotic break. And people don't talk about this. They just say, oh, it's normal. It's like in every lotion nowadays even too. And I'm not saying you can't use a lotion that has it in it, but we think of it, it's so normalized. We don't even think of anything wrong with it anymore because most people don't know. It really does affect you mentally. Crime scene shows. I cannot tell you how many women I come across who love true crime stories. And I just heard somebody turn to somebody else. I'm not going to say anything. But even kids are watching these shows with their parents, and it's normalizing dysfunctional societies, it's normalizing crime and that sort of thing, and it causes us to have anxiety and fear. I know because I used to be very interested in these shows just from a psychological perspective. And I found myself one time leaving my condo, this was years ago, and I put my keys between my fingers. And I wasn't even in an unsafe place. It was totally gated. But because I had watched this show, it caused me to feel more anxious about my surroundings. And I'm not saying don't be safe, but how's that anxiety affecting me when I'm going around because I'm constantly reinforcing this idea that everything is unsafe? Another thing, pornography and sex outside of marriage and even abortion. I cannot tell you how many times I have asked women in assessments, have you ever had an abortion? And gotten the answer after we did some more talking. Every single woman I have ever met that had an abortion, and now I'm not saying I've met every single woman, don't get me wrong, they know to the day how old that child would be if they had let that child live. So when you hear all these women talking about, oh, it doesn't affect me, I'm so happy I was able to have this choice, they're not talking. Have any of you ever heard that quote from Shakespeare, thou doth protest too much? Sometimes people say things because they're trying to overcome the feelings that come with their decisions. They're trying to convince themselves. And I've heard so many women say, oh, I'm so happy about this choice that I've been able to make. But they're not talking about the grief on the other side of that, too, that they're experiencing. And what happens when you have aborted a child only to have others after? What does that do to you, depression and anxiety-wise? But we don't talk about these things, but it is contributing to our society's depression and anxiety. I saw 2 women recently that both took that measure because of medical and lifestyle reasons. And those 2 women were definitely, absolutely, painfully grieving the loss of that child. In fact, one woman realized she probably couldn't have children after that because of her age. And how much she wanted a child just in that moment, she thought that it wasn't the best timing. Social media. It's easy to share without filtering, and then we have this idea of FOMO, fear of missing out. We think everybody's having more fun than we are, but that's not necessarily true. I see some of those people have been my friends on Facebook. And they're all telling everybody how great their lives are, but they're seeing me every week to tell me how not great their lives are. By the way, I don't often befriend my clients, but sometimes it happens where I don't know it's going to happen, that they'll be my client. Technology. Sometimes we have an addiction to being busy. You have 15 different apps open and you're going back and forth while you're looking at your computer and you're scrolling and all that sort of thing. Sometimes that causes us to be more anxious too. Shows, movies, and chat rooms that normalize depression and anxiety. Some of my clients have actually had to get off of blogs for depression and anxiety because that's all that people talk about on there. All of their symptoms and all of their problems. In fact, I do a group every day, Monday through Friday, for depression and anxiety. And one of the things I have stopped asking is, how do you feel? What happens when you have a group of 10 people come into your group and they all are talking about how awful their lives are? So do you know what I do instead? I ask, what are you grateful for today? I want to develop those neural pathways that encourage getting out of depression, not keep them stuck in depression and anxiety. And a lot of people don't realize there are a lot of underground chat rooms that their kids are even in that are teaching them things that cause them to be depressed and anxious as well. How about focusing on the negative and tragedies or doubt, even, dare I say, end time events? Do you know how many kids I have worked with? Their parents have sent them to me, or I've even met with them online, because the parents are worried about their children. And what do the children tell me when I talk to them? My parents watch sermons about what's going to happen in the end all the time. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong knowing with what's going to happen in the end, But what happens when that's all you're consuming and you're not also explaining to your child that God is a God of love and He's there to take care of us and we will not have to worry about what we go through in the end because He will be there for us? These children are terrified and they have nightmares and terrible anxiety over this. So we have to have a balance. And I think Satan also loves to attack us in areas of imbalance. You know, even good things can be bad if they're the sole focus that we focus on. Poor diet and exercise. I don't think I have to explain that one too much. But the things that we eat, we don't often realize. I ask my clients sometimes, if you could have your dream car, what car would you want? Just think about that for a second. Some of you won't even care. Maybe your dream house. But you know, if something goes bad on your dream car, you can find a replacement part or you can even get another car. But what happens when you're not treating your body well? You're not putting the right fuel, you're not getting the right exercise. Can you get a new body? Can you get a new brain? You know, as soon as if they start putting brains in people and replacing them, you're not the same person anymore because the brain is what makes you you. And so we take better care of our houses and our cars sometimes than we do of our own bodies and brains. And we really need to consider maybe my depression has to do with gut issues or other issues that I'm not dealing with, even hormonal issues from food and toxin things that we take in. Substance use and early sexual experiences. A lot of people, contrary to what they say, regret their early sexual experiences, especially when they have nothing to do with marriage. Another thing is living in opposition to values. Many of us, we want to believe that we can do whatever we want to do whenever we want to do it, but then we don't realize that those things that we grew up with, the truths that we grew up with in our homes, our spiritual homes, you can't just go against those things without there being some kind of, consequence to them. And a lot of people are trying to fight the truth because they want to develop new values and beliefs, not realizing that the old ones always worked and they're just trying to run away from them. Focusing on being happy versus duty and work. Do you know there's something really beautiful that happens when you work? Your body creates something called dopamine. Now you can get that artificially, but it always has side effects when you do it artificially through drugs and other things. But when you get it naturally, it's a high that you don't come down from. And we don't often realize, especially when we teach our kids these things even too, that we're actually depriving our children of dopamine and developing a strong work ethic too when we don't give them work to do. And we're depriving them of even healthy minds because that dopamine leads to lack of depression, lack of anxiety when they have something purposeful and meaningful to do with themselves. Every young person who experiences depression and anxiety, I often find with them that they don't have something that gives them purpose and meaning in life. And having something to do gives you purpose and meaning. And not to mention, when you get a little bit older and not old enough to get a paycheck, I don't know about you, but that felt really good when I first got my first paycheck. that fought against a lot of anxiety and depression. And then especially lack of prayer and Bible study or not having a relationship with God. Those are some big things that have to do with depression and anxiety. But what can we do practically speaking besides just eliminate those things and add the things that we need to? One of the things that we can do, and I talked a bit about this in the Sabbath school, is really focus on our thoughts and our thinking. Many people I meet are great Adventists. They do everything, all the New Start principles like perfectly. They take care of their bodies, they put everything right in it, except their minds are not healthy. I don't want to be offensive to any other religion, but there are some religions that are very works-based. And I will meet people, sometimes they come from one of those works-based religions into Adventism, and they'll tell me all the things that they're doing, and I ask them, or I tell them, it doesn't sound like you actually are Adventist. they'll say, no, I am. I'm not Catholic anymore, or I'm not Buddhist, or whatever those religions are that are more works-based. And I'll say, well, it sounds like you are, because you're so focused on doing everything perfectly that you still think like you did in your old religion. That's not what Adventists believe. And it doesn't mean we don't take good care of ourselves, but what happens when we're beating ourselves up because we're not doing enough? We start to get depressed. We start to get anxious because we don't have a right view of our religion and our belief, because we don't have the right thoughts regarding it. So we really want to focus on our thoughts. And the verse that I brought out in Sabbath school was Philippians 4, verse 8. We want to focus on things that are true, honest, pure, lovely, and of good report. And it says in this verse, if there be any virtue, and if there be any praise, that we're supposed to do what? Think on these things. This is a prescription for good mental health. Sometimes we think of prescriptions as just supplements or medications, but there are lifestyle prescriptions that we're to do. And beyond just how we eat or drink or all those things, we also need to think differently. So how do we do this? One of the ways that we do this is to ask ourselves two questions. One, are the thoughts that I have true? Now, how many times do you ever ask yourself that? Is this true what I'm telling myself? Most of the time, we just assume because we're thinking it, it's true. And even sometimes the loudest thoughts or the most obtrusive thoughts are the ones that we accept just because they're there. We just assume. But when it comes to something that is true, I want you to think of this scientifically or even legally. If you go into a courtroom and the judge is in there, how does the judge decide which side is telling the truth? Evidence. And one of the ways that the judge decides regarding evidence is that they listen to both sides give their evidence. Can you imagine if the judge said, you know what, I already listened to the defendant's side, I don't think I need to hear anything else? How long do you think that judge would be working? Now, as our society gets worse, maybe a little bit longer. But that judge shouldn't be in their position very long if they only listen to one side of the evidence. But do you know that's how we are as human beings? We love to believe something, and then what do? We just gather all the evidence around this belief. So for instance, if I thought I was ugly, what am I going to do? I'm only going to remind myself of that second grade boy that told me I was ugly when I was in second grade or elementary school. I'm only going to remind myself of that day that I took a bad picture and got to see it on social media. I'm only going to look for those kinds of evidences. I'm not going to do what? I'm not going to look for the evidence that goes against my belief. Humanly speaking, we do not like to do this. I don't want to hear anything that tells me how wrong I am in my belief. We love to endorse and reinforce and support our beliefs. We don't love to challenge them. So what happens when you're willing to do that? When you're willing to say, you know what? Maybe I'm not right with this belief. Maybe I need to look for the support or the beliefs or the evidences that go against this belief. What would I come up with? Well, I had a friend in 5th grade that said I was pretty, or I had a moment where I took a really good picture, or something like that. All of those things, if we have a belief, we only want to reinforce it. And we have psychological terms for this. One is called belief perseverance. This is why you cannot tell somebody something contrary to what they believe. Have you ever tried to convince somebody that their candidate during a political time is not the right candidate? How well did that go for you? They're not going to believe you just because you give them some kind of evidence. And likewise, there's another term, confirmation bias. And that's where we go and gather all the information that supports our belief, even though we have other information that also counters it. We don't like to be told we're wrong. Ironically, I will hear people say, I am so dumb, nobody likes me, my life is so frustrating and unsuccessful and I can't do anything right. And then I say, well, is it possible that your belief isn't true? Nope, it's not possible. And I say, well, you just said you're dumb. So maybe you don't know better and you're actually doing better than you thought, or people like you more than you realize. Nope, I'm not wrong. That's the only belief they'll stick by, is that I'm this bad, because we don't like to be told we're wrong. So we have to ask, what's the first question? Well, we already do this anyway. What's the evidence that supports my belief? But the second question, what's the evidence that goes against my belief? The third one, though, is, do I have enough evidence to believe this in the first place? Do you know we like to make a lot of beliefs and we don't even have enough decision? How about, or enough information or evidence? How about the time when somebody says, nobody likes me? It's like, well, has anybody told you that? Well, no, but I can just tell. How can you tell? That way that person looked at me. Were they looking into the sun when they were looking at you? We make these beliefs and we've never even asked anybody, do you like me? By the way, when I was working in the group home, I worked in the group home with at-risk teens for 7 years. And these kids are the meanest kids you will ever come across. They have no reason to say thank you, to like you, or anything. And they will try every single tactic to make sure you know that they're not interested in having therapy with you, if you work as a therapist with them. Do you know how many kids I had tell me they didn't like me? There was one kid in particular. He told me for 9 months that he did not like me, and I'm giving you the G-rated version. Every single time I went to go get him to do therapy, I don't want to see you. Ask somebody else. This is stupid. I don't want to be here. Do you know, a month before I left, he was still there. They were there for about 9 to 12 months. He was still there. A month before I left, I told all of them, I'm going to be leaving. I'm going to be moving on to the job that I'm at currently. And all of a sudden, this kid was not the same kid anymore. Hey, miss, can I come see you? Hey, can I come see you now? I just saw you an hour ago. I have to see another kid. Well, they don't want to come. Can I see you instead? And I'm like, what happened? Do you know sometimes even when people say they don't like you, they don't even know whether they like you or not? So how do I know if somebody truly doesn't like me, or if they're just saying that because they don't like themselves or they don't like anybody or whatever the case may be? But we get hung up on this belief and we hold on to it and we take it with us everywhere we go because oh, well, this confirms my belief. This is evidence. But it may not even be enough evidence. What happens in a courtroom when a judge doesn't have enough evidence? Dismiss the case. Even a jury, we don't have enough evidence. We can't make a decision or come to a decision. You have the right to say in a moment when you're wanting to make a belief or have a belief, but you don't know what's true, to say, you know what, I'm going to put this to the side and I'll decide later whether or not this is true. You don't have to believe something just because you think it. You can put it to the side. I call them cold cases. You know what a cold case is? Don't have enough evidence to finish the case and come to a decision? Put it to the side. Have a bunch of cold cases. Do you know the Bible talks about being the salt of the earth? You've all heard this. And we all, whenever I've heard this, I've thought, oh, you know, we're supposed to preserve because that's what salt does, add flavor because that's what salt does. Do you know what the technical translation of salt is in the Bible? It actually means prudent. What does a prudent person do? Do they make rash decisions? Do they believe anything they're told? They look at both sides. They weigh things out. What would happen if we were truly the salt of the earth? What would this world be like if all Christians were truly salt of the earth and prudent? I would love it being here. It would be great. We'd all love it. We wouldn't have all the issues that we have with each other. We wouldn't argue just because somebody told us something and we're not sure if it's actually true, but we like them enough to just side with them anyway. We wouldn't do that. And so we want to be prudent. Now, I love this. Remember how David said, Lord, how many are my foes? How many rise up against me? Many are saying of me, God will not deliver him. Do you know what he says right after that? He counters what he just said. He says, but you, Lord, are a shield around me. What is he doing? He's challenging his first thought with new evidence that he's willing to look at. But you, Lord, are a shield around me, my glory, the one who lifts my head. I call out to the Lord, and he answers me from his holy mountain. I lie down and sleep. I wake again because the Lord sustains me. I will not fear, though tens of thousands assail me on every side. He's got the evidence for the belief he starts with, but then what does he do? The evidence against the belief. He puts all of the evidence together before he makes his decision. The second question we have to ask, though, is this helpful? And the reason we have to ask that, because a lot of things are true. Was it not true that David had people coming against him? But how helpful is it to remind him that of it over and over and over again? Many of us get stuck in the truth so much so that we can't see the rest of the truth. And when we ask, is it helpful, we want to ask the question because does this help me move forward or does it keep me stuck where I've been all along? And David says, remember this verse I read earlier, I am worn out from my groaning. All night long I flood my bed with weeping and drench my couch with tears. But he also reminds himself something that's helpful. For the Lord has heard my weeping. The Lord has heard my cry for mercy. The Lord accepts my prayer. He's reminding himself. He goes from the negative belief and challenges that and goes to a new belief. So what can we do when we experience lies? What about the lie, my problems could never be solved? I could never feel truly happy or fulfilled. How about replacing that with the truth? I can name several problems that have been solved. Do you know oftentimes we actually disqualify positives in our life? That's actually a thinking distortion, a cognitive distortion. By the way, if you ever think that your problems can't be solved, I would like you to look at your feet right now. I want you to answer me a question. Is your right shoe on your right foot? How about your left shoe? Is it on your left foot? Do you know you all solved a problem? Because I'm guessing when you were younger, you had the problem of putting your shoe on the right foot. Did you not? Did you not all solve that problem? You know how to do it. Here's the thing. We ignore those things and we only focus on the problems thereafter. Every time we solve a problem, oh, my problems could never be solved. I couldn't be happy. Well, ask yourself, when was the last time I did experience some happiness? Or last time I experienced a problem being solved? What does that help you do? It helps you solve the next one, gives you a little oomph to get going. How about this lie? I'm basically worthless, defective, and inferior to others. Just because I feel worthless, feeling worthless does not make you worthless. Did you know that? If you ever want to read something, read page 668 in Desire of Ages. It's one of my favorite passages in Spirit of Prophecy. She tells us that we're not allowed to value ourselves. You know why? Because there was already a value placed on us. Did you know you don't get to decide how worthwhile or worthless you are? What decides that? Who decides that? The one who made you. You don't get to decide that. And Jesus even reinforced that value with his death. He gets to decide. How about if I'm numb, I need to hurt myself to feel something? With the truth, I can try healthy ways of feeling. Or the lie, no one will understand. They already have their own problems to deal with. Maybe I haven't asked the right people or enough people. My problems are important too. Or no one cares. They'd be better off without me. Replace it with the truth. Some people care and God cares. This isn't the end of my testimony. Some of the best stories start with the biggest problems. I love reading stories of people overcoming. If you haven't read a lot of those stories, start now. Most inspiring, encouraging thing. I want to give you some help, some practical help. These are some books that I think are exceptionally helpful, and they come from the right kind of thinking too. There's a lot of bad therapy out there. I won't get into that too much, but some people get worse going to see a therapist because they're not the right kind of therapist to have the right kind of truth. By the way, there's only one kind of truth, not my truth or your truth. God gets to decide what's true. And Mind, Character, and Personality, especially the second volume, is an amazing practical application. Every time I hear people say, but the church never talks about this stuff, I go, well, you haven't read Spirit of Prophecy yet, and you haven't read your Bible yet, because there's a lot of stuff in both of those that talk about mental health. So open up Mind, Character, and Personality. Also, a really good book called Telling Yourself the Truth by Mary Chapin and William Backus. Those are both good. And then there's a workbook that you can even do to get really practical called Learning to Tell Myself the Truth. There's even a book for couples called Telling Each Other the Truth. Did you know you can tell your spouse the truth too? Sometimes they get off a little bit. Not my husband, though, never. Also, the book SOS, Help for Emotions, is great for anxiety and depression. And one, it's helpful to seek help. Sometimes we do need to seek help, but find somebody who is biblically based, not just a Christian therapist. Sometimes even the Christian ones, I call it potluck religion. I can't tell you how many Christians I meet who I like a little bit of this and a little bit of that in my Christianity, and I like some Buddhism here and something over here, and I'm like, that's not Christian though anymore. It's just potluck religion. You just developed your own religion. So get somebody who does biblical cognitive behavioral therapy. That's all the things that I've been encouraging you with. Meditation. Did you know meditation is healthy? In some forms. There's different types of meditation. One type of meditation, though, that is healthy is the type of meditation that David did. He meditated on God's word and his promises. Meditation isn't just sitting like this with your arms up going om. That's not the only kind of meditation. We can do this in a healthful way, biblically speaking, by focusing on God's word and his promises and even true and helpful things around us. Like even going out into nature can be really helpful to see, if God cares about that flower, how can he not care for me? Gratitude. We just played a game the other night called the gratitude game. You can go around with your family and just go through the alphabet and try to remember as many things as you can that start with each letter that you're grateful for. And then if you want to make it even more challenging, you can actually try to memorize all of them as you go through. I think it's fun. Not everybody likes that, but you can do it in a simple form too. And then if you're interested, the practice that I work with, Beautiful Minds Medical, we do even have an online program that you can sign up for and purchase too. I want to leave you with a quote, though, that I think is especially beautiful, that comes from Ellen White's writing. She says in this quote, I saw him, and she's talking about a gentleman who is having trouble with depression, and maybe even anxiety too. She says, I saw him looking on the dark side, distrustful of himself and looking down into the grave. Now, this man was not standing on the edge of a 6-foot deep hole. This is metaphorical. What does it mean to be looking down into the grave? Suicidal, very depressed, wanting to end his life. She says then, he must not dwell on these things, but look to Jesus, a pattern that is unerring. He must encourage cheerfulness and courage in the Lord. She's not telling somebody else to encourage him. What is she telling him? To encourage himself. Talk faith, talk hope. We don't like to do this when we're depressed and have anxiety, do we? Everything in our body is saying, do something else. Focus on the bad. Focus on what's going wrong. But she says, no, talk faith, talk hope. You don't even have to believe it yet. Just talk it. Rest in God and not feel that a severe, taxing effort is required on his part. All that God requires is simple trust to drop into his arms with all his weakness and brokenness and imperfection. And Jesus will help the helpless and strengthen and build up those who feel that they are very weakness itself. God will be glorified in his affliction. This is the best part of your sad story. Did you know that? Do you want a boring story told about your life? Nobody's going to write a book about your life. Nobody's going to make a movie about your life if it's boring and everything just goes perfectly fine. But she says that God will be glorified in his affliction through the patience and faith and submission exemplified by him, this man. Oh, this will prove the power of the truth we profess. It is consolation when we need it. It is support when every prop of an earthly nature, which has been a measurable support, is removed. This is where we get that song, A Mighty Fortress is Our God, or How I've Proved Him O'er and O'er. That's one of my favorite lines. It's been in my mind like the last year. How I've proved him o'er and o'er. How do I prove him if I don't get to see what he can do? The best stories are when you think nothing could change this. It's as bad as it could possibly be. Nothing could change. And that's when God loves to say, oh, no, 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 no. Wait till you see what I can do in this moment. Your depression is not too hard for God. Your anxiety is not too hard for God. He can turn that into something beautiful. And I can say that because I am one of those people. I experienced horrible anxiety when I was a child. I had horrible stomach aches. Not headaches so much, but just terrible, terrible stomach aches. And I was like this all the time. I just felt so tense and so stressed all the time. And God has taken that away from me, and the depression that went with it too. I can tell you from a human experience, my own testimony, that God does that. And look what I'm doing today with it. I'm a therapist. You know my favorite thing that clients tell me? They don't usually tell me anymore. But when I've heard clients say, oh, you can't understand what I'm going through. You just read that in a book somewhere. I'm like, at first I hated hearing it. I felt like I had to prove something. No, I've been through hard stuff too. But then I realized it doesn't show. God has helped me so much with the anxiety and depression and removed it so much that people can't even tell I had it. What a testimony. My scars don't show. I have to tell people now to convince them. So when my client comes in and says, oh, I'm the worst person, I haven't had a good situation at my job, or everybody at my job hates me, I think, I know how that feels. I know so many different things, not everything, but I know a lot of them. And they don't have to know because I'm going, oh yeah, I know, girlfriend, I'm so sorry, I'm going through that too. I've overcome those things through God's help. If you are still struggling and you want support, I want to offer you a free resource. So some colleagues of mine and I have started a podcast several years ago, and it's called the Brain People Podcast. And you can go on YouTube, you can go on Spotify, Apple, wherever you listen to podcasts. And every other week we put out a new podcast, and we talk about some of the things that I've mentioned today and other things as well. And if you'd like to utilize that resource, I encourage you to try it out. It's just something I can offer you for free. And who doesn't like a freebie? So let's bow our heads and end the service.